She stood there in her $5,000 gown, pointing a manicured finger at my chest, like a loaded weapon. "Get out," she screamed. "This venue is for the elite, not for charity cases like you." I looked at her. I looked at the security guard she had summoned, and I smiled, because she had just tried to kick the owner out of her own building. Hello everyone, I am Mary. In my 60 years on this earth, I have seen families torn apart by secrets. But this story changes everything. It begins on a crisp Saturday afternoon in late October, the kind of day where the sky is a piercing shade of blue, and the air smells of dried leaves and wood smoke. I was driving my 10-year-old silver Buick sedan up the long winding gravel driveway of the Gilded Rose estate. The tires crunched satisfyingly over the stones, a sound that usually brought me peace, but today it only amplified the nervous fluttering in my stomach. To anyone watching, I probably looked like exactly what my daughter-in-law Isabella said I was. A dowdy grandmother in an off-the-rack navy dress from a department store clearance rack, clutching a purse that had seen better decades. I could feel the steering wheel vibrating under my hands, not because of the car's age, but because of the sheer magnitude of the secret I was carrying. You see, Isabella thought she was the queen of this castle today. She thought she had pulled off the social coup of the season by securing this venue. What she didn't know, and what my own son Daniel didn't know, was that the Gilded Rose didn't just accept their reservation because they were special. They accepted it because the owner told them to. And I was driving on my own property. I slowed down as I approached the massive iron gates, the ones I had paid $40,000 to restore just 6 months ago. The valet, a young man with a sharp jawline and a uniform that cost more than my car, frowned slightly as I pulled up behind a line of Bentleys and Mercedes. I saw his eyes flick to the dent on my rear bumper, and then to my face. I rolled down the window and smiled, the polite, unassuming smile I had perfected over years of being overlooked. "Name, please?" he asked, his tone clipped and professional, bordering on dismissive. "Eleanor Vance," I said softly. "I am the grandmother of the bride." He checked his clipboard, running a gloved finger down the list. "Ah, yes. You can park around the back in the overflow lot, ma'am. The main circle is reserved for the bridal party and VIP guests." I felt a small sharp sting in my chest. Of course. Overflow. Even at my granddaughter's wedding I was overflow. But I didn't argue. I didn't tell him that I signed his paycheck, or that the asphalt he was standing on was paid for by my investment portfolio. I simply nodded, said thank you, and drove around to the back. It was better this way. I needed to see exactly how Isabella treated me when she thought I was nothing. It was the only way to know if she deserved the mercy I was considering showing her. I walked from the overflow lot, which was essentially a dirt patch behind the catering trucks, carefully picking my way through the mud so I wouldn't ruin my sensible heels. The music from the string quartet drifted out through the open French doors, a hauntingly beautiful melody that I had personally requested when I reviewed the event sheet with the manager weeks ago. I entered the ballroom through the side terrace, trying to slip in unnoticed. The room was breathtaking. It was a sea of cream and gold. Crystal chandeliers the size of small cars hung from the vaulted ceiling, casting a warm glittering light over the 300 guests. I paused by a massive arrangement of white hydrangeas and ran my hand over the velvet tablecloth. It was rich and heavy. I remembered approving the budget for these linens. I remembered the invoice for the imported flowers. I remembered the wire transfer for the vintage champagne tower that was currently being assembled in the center of the room. It was all perfect. It was exactly what my granddaughter Sophie had dreamed of since she was a little girl playing dress-up in my attic. I felt a surge of warmth knowing that I had made this happen for her, without her ever knowing. But that warmth evaporated the moment I looked for my seat. The seating chart was displayed on a large ornate mirror near the entrance, written in beautiful calligraphy. I stood behind a group of women in sequined gowns, waiting for them to move so I could find my name. I assumed I would be at table 1 or 2, with the immediate family. That was standard protocol. That was basic etiquette. When the crowd cleared, I stepped forward, my finger hovering over the top of the list. Table 1. Daniel Vance. Isabella Vance. The groom's parents. The maid of honor. My name wasn't there. I frowned, feeling a cold drop of confusion slide down my spine. I checked table 2. Cousins. Aunts. Uncles. No Eleanor. I checked table 3. Table 4. My finger moved faster and faster down the list, the panic rising in my throat. Had she forgotten me? Had she actually forgotten to assign a seat to the mother of the groom? And then I found it. At the very bottom of the list, in a font that seemed almost smaller than the rest. Eleanor Vance. Table 19. I stared at the number. 19. There were only 20 tables in the room. I turned around and scanned the ballroom, looking for table 19. I looked past the dance floor, past the head table, past the prime spots near the windows with the view of the rose garden. I finally spotted it. It was shoved into the far back corner, directly next to the swinging double doors of the kitchen. It was a small round table clearly added as an afterthought, squeezed between a decorative pillar and the station where the waiters scraped the dirty plates. There was no centerpiece, just a simple white cloth and 4 chairs. The people already sitting there were the wedding photographer's assistant, a confused-looking elderly man I didn't recognize, and a teenage girl who was looking at her phone. This was Siberia. This was where you put the people you were obligated to invite, but wished hadn't come. I walked slowly toward the table, my legs feeling like lead. As I got closer, the sensory details of the insult became impossible to ignore. A waiter burst through the kitchen doors, carrying a tray of appetizers, and a blast of hot air smelling of garlic and stale grease hit me full in the face. The noise of clattering dishes and shouting chefs from the kitchen was audible over the string quartet. Isabella hadn't just seated me at the back. She had seated me in the trash. I pulled out my chair, which wobbled slightly on the uneven floor, and sat down. The photographer's assistant gave me a sympathetic half-smile. I gripped my purse in my lap, so tight my knuckles turned white. I looked across the room to the head table, where Isabella was holding court. She was wearing a silver gown that shimmered under the lights, throwing her head back in laughter, holding a glass of champagne like a scepter. She looked triumphant. She looked like a woman who had successfully scrubbed the stain of poverty from her perfect picture. She thought she had put me in my place. She thought she had hidden the embarrassing poor relation in the corner where no one would see. I took a deep breath, inhaling the smell of the kitchen exhaust, and felt something inside me click. It was the sound of a bridge burning. She wanted to treat me like the help. Fine. I would sit here. I would watch. And when the time was right, I would remind her that the woman sitting by the kitchen doors owned the very chair she was sitting on. I sat there for 20 minutes nursing a glass of tepid water, because the waiters hadn't bothered to offer wine to table 19. Every time the kitchen door swung open behind me, a gust of hot, humid air smelling of roasting beef and industrial dishwasher soap washed over me, making the hair on the back of my neck frizz. I kept my eyes fixed on the center of the room, watching my granddaughter Sophie. She looked radiant standing near the ice sculpture, laughing with her bridesmaids. Her dress was a cloud of silk organza, a custom design I had secretly paid for when Isabella told her the budget only allowed for a rental. Sophie didn't know that, of course. She thought the boutique had given her a miraculous discount because she was such a beautiful bride. I watched her happiness and told myself that sitting next to the garbage station was a small price to pay for that smile. But peace is a fragile thing, especially when a predator is in the room. I felt eyes on me before I saw her. The prickle on the back of my neck wasn't from the kitchen heat this time. It was from a cold, malevolent gaze. I turned my head slowly and there she was. Isabella had stopped mid-sentence, in her conversation with the mayor's wife. Her eyes were locked on me across the ballroom, and even from 50 feet away, I could see the curvature of her sneer. She handed her champagne glass to a passing waiter, with a dismissive flick of her wrist, and began to move toward me. She didn't walk, she marched. Her silver sequin gown hissed as her thighs brushed together, a sound like a snake moving through dry grass. The crowd seemed to part for her, not out of respect but out of the instinctual fear of being in the path of a hurricane. I took a sip of my water, trying to wet a throat that had suddenly gone dry as dust. I wasn't afraid of her, not really. I held the deed to this building in my safe at home. But years of conditioning, years of being told I wasn't good enough, or rich enough, or sophisticated enough, still triggered a physical reaction in my body. My hands trembled slightly. My heart rate spiked. She stopped at my table, looming over me, blocking out the light from the chandeliers. Up close, her makeup was flawless, a mask of contour and highlight that hardened her features into something statuesque and cruel. She didn't say hello. She didn't wish me a happy afternoon. She looked down at my dress, then at my shoes, then back at my face, with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. "Margaret," she said, and her voice was a low hiss that cut through the ambient chatter like a serrated knife. "What do you think you are doing?" I set my glass down on the wobbly table, making a soft clinking sound. "I am attending my granddaughter's wedding, Isabella." I smiled politely, though it took every muscle in my face to hold it. "It is a lovely ceremony." She didn't return the smile. Her eyes narrowed into slits. "I am not talking about you being here, although we both know you were barely on the list. I am talking about that." She gestured vaguely at my body with a manicured hand. "That rag you are wearing. Did you pull it out of a dumpster on the way here?" I looked down at my navy dress. It was a simple sheath dress from Macy's. It was clean. It was pressed. It was respectful. It cost $150, which was a lot of money for the woman she thought I was. "It is perfectly appropriate," I said, my voice steady. "It is navy blue." The invitation said formal attire. Isabella let out a short, sharp laugh that sounded like glass breaking. It drew the attention of the table next to us. People were starting to turn in their chairs, sensing the drama the way sharks sense blood in the water. Formal attire, Margaret, means designer. It means silk. It means effort. It does not mean wearing a polyester sack that smells like mothballs and failure. You look like the help. Actually, you look worse than the help, because at least the waitstaff have uniforms that fit. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, a burning flush of humiliation that I couldn't control. A hush was spreading outward from our corner. The string quartet was still playing a lively waltz, but the guests nearby had stopped talking, pretending to inspect their napkins while listening to every word. Isabella lowered her voice but increased the intensity, leaning in close enough that I could smell her expensive perfume, a cloying scent of gardenias and money. "Listen to me very carefully," she whispered. "I have spent months curating this event. I have invited the most important people in the city. The mayor is here. My partners from the firm are here. I will not have you ruining the aesthetic of my daughter's wedding with your poverty. You stick out like a sore thumb." I gripped the edge of the table, my fingernails digging into the cheap tablecloth. "I am Sophie's grandmother," I said quietly. "I belong here." Isabella straightened up, crossing her arms over her chest. "Not looking like that, you don't. I want you to leave. Now. Before the official photographer starts making the rounds. I don't want your face or that dress in a single picture. Go sit in your car. Go to a diner." I don't care where you go. Just get out of my ballroom. The cruelty was breathtaking. It wasn't just that she wanted me gone. It was that she felt entirely justified in demanding it. She truly believed that her money, or rather the money she thought she had, gave her the right to erase a human being because they didn't match the decor. I looked around the room. I saw people whispering behind their hands. I saw looks of pity and looks of amusement. But I didn't see anyone stepping forward. I didn't see anyone defending the old woman, being bullied in the corner. And that is when I knew. I knew that simply revealing the truth later wouldn't be enough. I needed to let this play out. I needed her to dig the hole so deep that she could never climb out of it. I needed everyone in this room to see exactly who she was before I showed them exactly who I was. So I didn't leave. I didn't stand up. I looked her right in the eye and said the one thing I knew would push her over the edge. No, Isabella. I don't think I will. Sophie invited me, and I am going to stay for dinner. The look on her face shifted from disdain to shock, and then settled into a cold, hard rage. She hadn't expected resistance. She expected the doormat to lie flat. She took a step back, her voice rising loud enough now for half the room to hear. You are refusing to leave. After I paid for all of this. After I graciously allowed you to come. You are going to defy me in my own venue. I stayed silent, sipping my water. She turned around, scanning the room frantically, until she spotted a security guard standing near the exit. You there, she screamed, pointing a shaking finger. Yes, you. Get over here. We have a trespasser. The word trespasser hung in the air, like smoke from a blown-out candle, acrid and undeniable. For a moment time seemed to stretch and warp, the string quartet trailing off into a discordant silence, as the cellist realized something was wrong. 300 heads turned in unison. The sound of silverware scraping against china ceased. The murmur of polite conversation vanished. All that remained was the hum of the air conditioning and the heavy suffocating weight of 300 pairs of eyes locking onto table 19. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded in my lap. I could feel the blood pulsing in my ears, a rhythmic thrumming that sounded like a war drum. It was the physical sensation of humiliation, the biological response to being hunted by the tribe. My instinct was to shrink, to hunch my shoulders and look at the floor, to apologize for existing. But I forced myself to keep my chin up. I forced myself to look at the security guard, who was walking toward us, with a look of pure confusion on his face. His name tag read Marcus. He was a large man with broad shoulders and a kind face, the type of man who probably spent his weekends coaching Little League. He looked at Isabella, in her shimmering silver gown, pointing a shaking finger. He looked at me in my navy department store dress, sitting quietly with a glass of water. He looked at the half-eaten appetizers on the tables nearby. He knew this wasn't a security threat. He knew this was a family dispute, spilling out onto his carpet. But he had a job to do, and Isabella was the one screaming orders. "Excuse me, ma'am," Marcus said, his voice deep and rumbling, as he stopped a respectful distance from the table. "Is there a problem here?" Isabella spun on him, her eyes flashing with manic energy. "Yes, there is a problem," she snapped, her voice pitching up an octave so that everyone could hear. "This woman is refusing to leave. She is crashing a private event. I have asked her nicely. I have asked her repeatedly. And she is just sitting there mocking me. I want her escorted off the property immediately." Marcus looked at me again. He hesitated. I could see the conflict behind his eyes. He didn't want to throw an elderly woman out of a wedding. It went against every instinct he had. "Ma'am," he said, addressing me gently, "is this true? Were you asked to leave?" I took a slow breath, inhaling the scent of the expensive lilies that I had paid for. Marcus, I said, my voice calm but carrying just enough authority to make him blink. I am the grandmother of the bride. My granddaughter invited me. I am simply trying to eat my dinner. Isabella let out a shriek of frustration that sounded like a tearing sheet. Oh, stop lying, she yelled. Sophie invited you out of pity. She didn't think you would actually show up, looking like a beggar. Listen to me, security guard. I paid for this room. I paid for the food. I paid for the open bar these people are drinking from. I have spent $50,000 making this day perfect, and I have the right to decide who sits at my tables. I watched her lie. I watched the words tumble out of her mouth with such conviction that I almost believed them myself. $50,000. It was a number she had pulled out of thin air. A number she probably wished she had, but certainly didn't. The truth was, she and Daniel hadn't paid a dime. They had sent me the invoices 2 months ago, claiming they were short on liquidity because of some investments. I had paid the venue directly from my holding company. I had paid the caterer. I had paid the florist. Isabella hadn't even paid for the dress she was wearing, which I happened to know was put on a credit card that I paid the monthly balance on. The audacity was breathtaking. She was standing there, claiming ownership of my generosity, using my own money as a weapon to bludgeon me with. I looked around the room. I saw the guests whispering. They believed her. Why wouldn't they? She looked the part. She looked rich. She looked powerful. I looked like the poor relation trying to crash the party for a free meal. I saw a woman in a green sequin dress lean over to her husband and whisper something behind her hand. I saw them look at me and shake their heads. They were judging me. They were disgusted by the old woman who wouldn't just leave and let the nice rich lady enjoy her party. Isabella the First said, standing up slowly, my knees cracking slightly in the silence. Please stop this. You are making a scene. Think about Sophie. This is her wedding day. Do you really want to do this in front of everyone? Isabella stepped closer, invading my personal space, until I could see the heavy foundation settling into the creases around her eyes. Don't you dare talk to me about Sophie, she hissed. You don't care about Sophie. If you cared about her, you wouldn't have shown up here looking like a charity case. You are selfish, Margaret. You have always been selfish. You hoard your little social security checks, and you never contribute anything. You didn't chip in a dime for this wedding. Not a dime. And now you want to sit here and eat the filet mignon that I paid for. No, I won't have it. Marcus, get her out of here. If she isn't gone in 2 minutes, I am calling the police and having her arrested for trespassing. The threat hung there, heavy and absolute. Arrested. My own daughter-in-law wanted to put me in handcuffs at my granddaughter's wedding. I looked at Marcus. He looked pained. He looked at Isabella, then at me, then at the crowd watching with bated breath. Ma'am, he said to me, his voice apologetic. Look, I don't want any trouble. Maybe it is best if you just wait outside for a bit. Let things cool down. We can figure this out away from the guests. He was trying to be kind. He was offering me a dignified retreat, a chance to slink away into the shadows and disappear. A part of me wanted to take it. A part of me wanted to run to my car and drive until the gas tank was empty. But then I looked at the chandeliers above me. I looked at the marble floors beneath my feet. I looked at the waiters standing frozen with their trays. I owned this. All of it. This was my building, my business, my legacy. And this woman, who had contributed nothing but venom, was trying to kick me out of my own home. Something inside me hardened. It wasn't anger anymore. It was something colder. It was the absolute certainty of justice. I looked at Marcus and I smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of a trap snapping shut. Actually, Marcus, I said clearly, I think calling the police is an excellent idea. But before we do that, I would like to speak to the owner. The request to speak to the owner hung in the air for a moment, like a lead balloon. I saw Marcus, the security guard, blink in confusion, his eyes darting between me and the angry woman in the silver dress. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to tell me that the owner wasn't on the premises, or to explain that he couldn't just summon management on a whim, but Isabella didn't give him the chance. She threw her head back and laughed. It was a harsh barking sound that lacked any genuine humor. The owner, she mocked, her voice dripping with incredulity. You want to speak to the owner? Margaret, look around you. This is a private estate. We rented the entire property. For all intents and purposes, right now I am the owner. I am the one writing the checks. I am the one calling the shots. You don't get to bypass me. You don't get to appeal to a higher authority, because there is no one higher than the person paying the bill. She took a step closer to me, invading my personal space, until I could see the tiny veins of rage pulsing in her forehead. You are just stalling. You are trying to embarrass me. Well, it isn't going to work. Marcus grabbed her arm. Escort her out. If she struggles, drag her. I don't care what it looks like anymore. Just get her out of my sight. Marcus shifted his weight, looking uncomfortable. He reached for his radio, probably to call for backup, or maybe just to ask someone what on earth he was supposed to do with two screaming women and a silent grandmother. But before he could press the button, a commotion near the head table drew everyone's attention. The crowd of onlookers parted, like the Red Sea. A man was pushing his way through the ring of spectators, looking flushed and harried. It was Daniel, my son, my beautiful weak son. He looked dashing in his black tuxedo, the one I knew he hadn't paid for, because I had seen the rental charge on the supplementary credit card statement 3 days ago. His hair was perfectly styled, and for a split second looking at him, I felt a surge of hope. This was the boy I had raised. This was the boy I had nursed through fevers and driven to soccer practice and held when his first girlfriend broke his heart. Surely he would stop this. Surely he would look at his wife and tell her that treating his mother like a criminal was crossing a line. He stopped between us, breathing hard, his eyes wide with panic. What is going on here? He asked, his voice tight with stress. I can hear you shouting from the other side of the room. People are staring, Isabella. The photographer is trying to cut the cake. What are you doing? Isabella spun on him, instantly transforming from a predator into a victim in the blink of an eye. It was a performance worthy of an Academy Award. Her shoulders slumped, her lower lip trembled, and she pointed a shaking finger at me. Oh, Daniel, thank God you are here, she cried, her voice wobbling with fake tears. It is your mother. She is ruining everything. She showed up uninvited, dressed like a bag lady, and now she is refusing to leave. She is making a scene. She is shouting at the staff. She is trying to destroy Sophie's wedding, just like she tried to destroy our rehearsal dinner. Daniel looked at her, and then he looked at me. I sat there quietly, my hands folded, my back straight. I wasn't shouting. I wasn't crying. I was just waiting. I looked into his eyes, searching for the spark of recognition, searching for the son who used to make me handmade cards for Mother's Day. I waited for him to say that I was invited. I waited for him to say that I had paid for his house, his car, and his lifestyle. I waited for him to defend me. But the spark wasn't there. Instead, I saw exhaustion. I saw a man who was terrified of his wife's temper, a man who had spent the last 10 years shrinking himself down to fit into the small box she allowed him to occupy. He looked at my dress and I saw him wince. He looked at the security guard and I saw him flush with embarrassment. He didn't see his mother. He saw a problem. He saw an obstacle to his peaceful evening. He let out a long, ragged sigh, rubbing his hand over his face. Mom, he said, and the tone of his voice broke my heart into 1,000 jagged pieces. Mom, why are you doing this? Why can't you just let us have one day? The injustice of it knocked the wind out of me. I stared at him, my mouth opening slightly. Daniel, I whispered. I am not doing anything. I am sitting here. Your wife is the one threatening to have me arrested. Sophie invited me. You know she did. Daniel shook his head, looking at the floor, unable to meet my gaze. Sophie is just a kid, Mom. She doesn't understand the dynamics. Look, Isabella put a lot of work into this. We spent a fortune on this venue. We wanted it to be perfect. There it was, the lie. The lie that he knew was a lie. He stood there and claimed they spent a fortune, when he knew for a fact that his bank account had been overdrawn last week, until I quietly transferred $5,000 to cover his mortgage. He was claiming credit for my money, while letting his wife kick me out of the building I bought. It was a betrayal so deep and so absolute that I physically felt it in my chest like a rib snapping. He was choosing her. He wasn't just choosing his wife, which I could almost understand. He was choosing the lie. He was choosing the facade of wealth over the mother who actually provided it. He looked up at me finally, his eyes pleading. Mom, please just go. Don't make the security guard drag you out. Just get in your car and go home. We can talk about this next week. We can have lunch or something. Just don't ruin tonight. Please, for me. The room went silent. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen behind me. I could hear the ice melting in my glass. Just go. Those two words echoed in my mind, bouncing off the walls of my memory. I looked at Isabella. She was smirking, a small triumphant curl of her red lips that she quickly hid when Daniel looked at her. She had won. She had turned my own son against me. She had successfully painted me as the villain in my own tragedy. I looked back at Daniel. I studied his face, memorizing the weakness in his jaw, the fear in his eyes. I realized in that moment that I had failed him. By fixing everything for him, by paying every bill and smoothing every road, I had created a man who couldn't stand up straight. I had created a coward. And now that coward was asking me to leave my own property so he could play pretend with his bully of a wife. Something inside me died then. The hope died. The maternal instinct to protect him died. And in its place, something cold and hard and very powerful began to wake up. I stood up slowly, pushing the chair back. The scraping sound was loud in the quiet corner. I picked up my purse. I smoothed down my navy dress. I looked Daniel dead in the eye. You want me to leave? I asked, my voice steady and devoid of all emotion. You are asking your mother to leave your daughter's wedding. Daniel swallowed hard, but he nodded. Yes, Mom. I think it is for the best. Just go. I nodded once. Very well, Daniel. I will go. But before I leave, I have one small piece of business to attend to. I turned to Marcus, who was watching this family implosion, with a look of profound pity. Marcus, I said, my voice ringing out clear and strong. I am not leaving the property. I am going to the main office. And I would like you to radio the general manager. Tell him that Mrs. Vance is here. Tell him that I require his presence immediately. And Marcus, tell him to bring the ownership deed and the master guest list. Isabella laughed again. A shrill, hysterical sound. Oh my God, she is delusional. She thinks she owns the place. Just get her out of here, Marcus. But Marcus didn't move. He was looking at me. He was looking at the way I stood. He was looking at the way I spoke. He saw something that Daniel and Isabella were too blind to see. He saw authority. I will call him ma'am, Marcus said quietly. Thank you, Marcus, I said. I will wait right here. And Daniel, I looked back at my son one last time. You said you wanted this day to be perfect. You should be careful what you wish for. Perfect comes with a price tag. And I think it is time you saw the bill. The air in the ballroom seemed to thicken, turning into a heavy suffocating blanket of tension that made it hard to breathe. The string quartet had officially stopped playing, realizing that no amount of Mozart could cover up the sound of a family imploding in the corner. Isabella stood with her hands on her hips, her chest heaving, with a mixture of rage and adrenaline. She looked like a silver statue of indignation, but I could see the tiny hairline cracks in her composure. She had expected me to fold. She had expected the poor dowdy mother-in-law to cry and run away in shame the moment she raised her voice. But I was still standing there. I was calm. And more importantly, I was asking for the manager with the authority of someone who knew exactly what the answer would be. Isabella laughed again, but the sound was brittle now, lacking the genuine amusement she had projected earlier. She turned to the crowd, casting a wide theatrical glance at the guests, who were now openly staring. "Can you believe this?" she shouted, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "She is delusional. She actually thinks she can demand meetings with the administration while trespassing at a private event." She looked back at me, her eyes gleaming with malice. "You want the general manager, Margaret? Fine. Let's get him out here. I would love to see the look on your face when he hands you over to the police. In fact, I insist on it. Marcus, call him. Tell him to get down here right now. Tell him the crazy woman in the polyester dress is harassing the paying clients." Marcus looked between us, his hand hovering over the radio on his shoulder. He looked at Isabella's flushed, angry face, and then he looked at mine. I didn't say a word. I just nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible movement that said go ahead. Marcus pressed the button. "This is security to administration," he said, his voice low and rumbling. "We have a situation in the main ballroom. Mrs. Vance is requesting Mr. Sterling immediately." There was a pause of static, then a crackly voice responded. "Copy that, Marcus. Is it urgent?" Marcus looked at me again. "Yes, sir. I believe it is. Mrs. Vance says it concerns the ownership of the property." The radio clicked off. Isabella rolled her eyes so hard, I thought they might get stuck in her head. "Ownership," she mocked, letting out a sharp breath. "Listen to yourself. You sound insane. Do you know who owns this place, Margaret? Because I do. I met him when we booked the venue. He is a very powerful, very busy man, and he isn't going to appreciate being dragged out of his office on a Saturday night to deal with your dementia." I watched her weave the lie. It was fascinating in a morbid sort of way, like watching a spider spin a web, knowing it was trapping itself. She had never met the owner. When they booked the venue, they had dealt with the event's coordinator, a lovely girl named Sarah, who I had personally instructed to give them the friends and family discount. I had never met Isabella in a professional capacity. I had stayed in the shadows, signing the checks and approving the contracts from my home office. But here she was standing in front of 300 people, claiming a personal relationship with a man who didn't exist. "Oh, you met him?" I asked, my voice soft and curious. The trap was set. All she had to do was step into it. Isabella puffed out her chest, smoothing the sequins on her dress. "Of course I met him. We had lunch. He was charmed by Sophie. He told us specifically that if we needed anything at all, we should just ask. And right now I am asking him to remove the trash from his ballroom." She said it loudly, making sure the mayor's wife at the next table heard her. She was building a narrative. She was the connected, wealthy socialite who was on a first-name basis with the elite, and I was the sad, embarrassing relative who needed to be managed. Daniel was standing behind her, looking like he wanted the floor to open up and swallow him whole. He knew she was lying. He had been at the booking meeting. He knew they had never met the owner, but he said nothing. He just stared at his shoes, twisting his wedding ring round and round on his finger. His silence was louder than her screaming, It confirmed everything I needed to know. He was complicit in her fantasy. He was willing to let her invent a reality where I was nothing, as long as it kept the peace. I looked back at Isabella. So he is a close friend then, I asked, pushing just a little harder. The owner. You would say you know him well. Isabella scoffed, tossing her hair over her shoulder. Better than you ever will, Margaret. He is a man of class. He hates disorder. When he gets here and sees you making a scene, he is going to ban you for life. He might even sue you for disrupting a commercial event. I hope you saved up your pension checks, because you are going to need a good lawyer. The crowd murmured. The threat of a lawsuit was juicy. It raised the stakes. I could see people pulling out their phones, discreetly holding them under the tables, to record the drama. The red recording lights were like little eyes in the semi-darkness. Good. I wanted this recorded. I wanted every word, every lie, every ounce of her hubris, documented for posterity. I wanted there to be no doubt later about what was said. I waited. The seconds ticked by like hours. The kitchen door swung open, and a waiter peeked out, saw the confrontation, and quickly ducked back inside. The smell of burning sugar wafted out. Someone had left a crème brûlée under the torch too long, it was fitting. Everything was burning down. I stood perfectly still, my hands clasped in front of me, channeling the energy of every boardroom meeting I had ever dominated. I wasn't the grandmother anymore. I wasn't the mother. I was the CEO. And I was watching a junior employee make a fatal error in judgment. Finally, the heavy double doors at the main entrance swung open. The sound echoed through the silent room. A hush fell over the crowd. Mr. Sterling walked in. He was a tall man in his 50s with silver hair and a suit that cost more than Isabella's car. He walked with the purposeful stride of a man who ran a multi-million-dollar estate. He didn't look at the guests. He didn't look at the decorations. He looked straight at the group of us, standing by the kitchen doors. Isabella straightened up, putting on her best smile, the one she used for people she needed something from. She stepped forward, ready to greet her old friend the owner. She was ready to be vindicated. She had no idea. She was walking toward her execution. Mr. Sterling crossed the ballroom floor, with the kind of quiet authority that makes people step out of the way without being asked. He was holding a thick leather folder under his arm, and his face was a mask of professional neutrality, though I could see the tightness around his eyes. He had been enjoying his Saturday evening off, probably having a scotch in his office, until my summons dragged him down here. Isabella didn't wait for him to reach us. She stepped forward to meet him, her heels clicking aggressively on the marble, cutting off his path like a line of police tape. Mr. Sterling, she exclaimed, throwing her hands up in a gesture of exasperated relief. Thank God you are finally here. We have a crisis. An absolute crisis. She gestured back at me with a sweep of her arm that was meant to be dramatic, but just looked manic. This woman has been harassing my guests. She is trespassing. She is refusing to follow security protocols. I need you to handle this immediately. I want her gone, and I want to know why your security team let her in the first place. Mr. Sterling stopped. He looked at Isabella, who was practically vibrating with indignation. He looked at Daniel, who was studying the pattern on the carpet, as if his life depended on it. And then he looked at me. His eyes locked onto mine for a brief second, a flicker of recognition and deference passing between us, before he turned his attention back to Isabella. Good evening, Mrs. Vance, he said, his voice cool and polished like a river stone. I was informed there was a dispute regarding the guest list. I came as quickly as I could. Is this the individual in question? He gestured slightly toward me. Isabella let out a huff of air, crossing her arms. Yes, obviously, who else would it be? Look at her. She is ruining the entire aesthetic. I told your guard to remove her 10 minutes ago, but he seems to be incapable of following simple instructions. I expect he will be disciplined for this. I watched Mr. Sterling's jaw tighten just a fraction. He didn't like being talked to like a servant, and he certainly didn't like his staff being threatened. I am sorry to hear that, Mrs. Vance, Mr. Sterling said smoothly. However, removing a guest from a wedding is a serious matter. We have to follow protocol. Protocol, Isabella shrieked, her voice cracking. The protocol is that I am the client. I am the one paying your salary tonight. I am the one who signed the contract. And I am telling you that this woman is uninvited. She is a gate crasher. And frankly, she is a liability. She has been shouting at me and making threats. She claims she knows the owner. Can you believe that? She actually stood there and told me she knows him. Isabella laughed again, that sharp, nervous sound. I told her I know him. I told her we are personal friends, but she is delusional. She needs professional help, not a seat at my table. The lie hung in the air, gross and distorted. I saw Mr. Sterling blink. He looked at Isabella with a mixture of confusion and insult. You know the owner, he repeated, his tone perfectly neutral, but I could hear the trap snapping shut. You are personal friends. Isabella nodded vigorously, sensing she was losing the room, and needing to bolster her authority. Yes, absolutely. We had lunch last month. He is a wonderful man, very charming. He assured me personally that my event would be flawless. So please, Mr. Sterling, do your job. Call him if you have to. Get him on the phone right now and tell him that Isabella Vance needs a favor. Tell him to authorize her removal. Better yet, call the police. I want a formal trespassing charge filed. I want a paper trail so she can never come near my family again. I stood there listening to her dig her own grave. She had just demanded the police. She had just demanded that the owner be called. She had just claimed a friendship with a man who didn't exist. It was perfect. It was the kind of total victory you usually only see in movies. I looked at Daniel one last time, giving him a final chance to speak up. A final chance to say, no, Isabella, stop lying. You never met the owner. But he didn't. He just stood there wiping sweat from his forehead, completely surrendered to her narrative. He was gone. The son I loved was buried under layers of cowardice and enabling. Mr. Sterling looked at me again. He saw the slight nod I gave him. He saw the cold resolve in my eyes. He turned back to Isabella, and for the first time, his professional mask slipped just enough to reveal the steel beneath it. Mrs. Vance, he said, his voice dropping an octave so that it was quiet, but carried to every corner of the silent room. I am afraid there has been a misunderstanding, a very significant one. You see, I cannot call the owner and tell him you need a favor. Isabella's eyes narrowed. And why not? Is he busy? Is he on vacation? I don't care. Interrupt him. This is an emergency. Mr. Sterling shook his head slowly. No, Mrs. Vance. I cannot call him because the owner of the Gilded Rose estate is not a man. And you certainly never had lunch with him. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a vacuum, where all the air has been sucked out of the room. Isabella froze, her mouth half open in a snarl that was slowly dissolving into confusion. Excuse me, she whispered. What did you say? Mr. Sterling took a step back, turning his body so that he was no longer facing her. He was facing me. He bowed his head slightly, a gesture of deep respect that sent a shockwave through the crowd. He wasn't looking at the woman in the silver dress anymore. He was looking at the woman in the navy polyester dress, standing by the kitchen doors. I cannot call the owner, he repeated clearly, because she is already here, and she has been waiting for you to stop screaming at her for the last 20 minutes. The silence that followed Mr. Sterling's declaration was so profound it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room, leaving a vacuum where sound used to exist. 300 people stood frozen in a tableau of shock. A waiter near the pillar dropped a silver fork, and it hit the marble floor with a chime that rang out like a church bell, echoing in the stillness. I watched Isabella's face. I watched the blood drain from her cheeks, in a slow descending curtain of pale, leaving her expensive rouge looking stark and clownish against her skin. Her mouth, which had been open in a snarl of entitlement, went slack. She blinked once, twice. Her brain was trying to process the information, trying to force the square peg of reality into the round hole of her delusions, but it wouldn't fit. She looked at Mr. Sterling, expecting him to laugh, expecting him to say it was a joke, a witty little prank to lighten the mood. But Mr. Sterling wasn't laughing. He was standing with his back to her, his posture deferential, his focus entirely on me. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a set of keys. They weren't just any keys. They were the master keys to the estate, attached to a heavy brass fob, engraved with the gilded rose crest. He held them out to me with both hands, like an offering to a queen. "Good evening, Mrs. Vance," he said, his voice warm and respectful, completely different from the frosty professional tone he had used with my daughter-in-law. "I apologize for the disturbance. I trust the staff has been treating you well, despite the confusion." I reached out and took the keys. The brass was cool and heavy in my palm. It was the weight of authority. It was the weight of ownership. I closed my fingers around them and felt a surge of calm wash over me. I looked at Isabella. She was shaking her head slowly, a jerky mechanical movement, like a doll with a broken neck. "No," she whispered. Her voice was thin and reedy, barely audible. "No, that is impossible. She is lying. You are lying. She drives a 10-year-old Buick. She shops with coupons. She lives in that little house on Maple Street. She doesn't own this. She can't own this. Look at her dress. Look at her shoes." She spun around to face the crowd, searching for an ally, searching for anyone who would validate her reality. "Tell him," she screamed, her voice cracking into hysteria. "Daniel, tell him. Tell him your mother is poor. Tell him she is on a fixed income. Tell him this is some kind of sick joke. She paid him to play on me." Daniel looked like he was going to be sick. His face had gone a shade of gray that reminded me of wet cement. He looked at the keys in my hand. He looked at the deference of the general manager. He looked at the security guard Marcus, who had stepped back and crossed his hands respectfully behind his back. The pieces were clicking into place in his mind. The mysterious loans I had given them over the years. The way I never complained about money. The way I had quietly paid off his college debt a decade ago. He realized in that moment that he didn't know his mother at all. He knew the version of me he wanted to see, the helpful, quiet scenery in his life, but he didn't know the woman standing in front of him. "Mom," he croaked, his voice dry. "Mom, what is going on? Is it true? Do you really own the Gilded Rose?" I stepped forward, moving out of the shadow of the kitchen doors and into the light of the chandelier. I didn't hunch my shoulders anymore. I stood at my full height. "Yes, Daniel," I said, my voice projecting clearly to the back of the room, without shouting. "I bought the Gilded Rose estate 13 months ago. I bought it as an investment, shortly after my portfolio yielded significant returns. I kept it quiet because I didn't want to change our relationship. I wanted you to love me for me, not for my assets." I looked at Isabella, who was breathing in short, sharp gasps, like a fish out of water. "And when Sophie told me she wanted to get married here, I made sure the dates were cleared. I made sure the staff was prepped. I made sure everything was perfect. I did it for her." Isabella let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "You," she stammered, pointing a shaking finger at me again. You are the owner. So when I told you I had lunch with the owner," I nodded, slowly finishing her sentence for her. "You were lying, Isabella. You never had lunch with the owner because the owner was sitting in your kitchen eating a tuna sandwich, while you complained about how hard it was to find good help. You invented a friendship with a powerful man to make yourself look important. You used my own property to belittle me. You tried to kick me out of my own building. Do you have any idea how foolish you look right now?" The crowd began to murmur. The tide had turned. I could feel it. The looks of judgment that had been directed at me were now directed at the woman in the silver dress. People were whispering, pointing, shaking their heads. The facade of the wealthy, connected socialite had shattered, leaving behind a liar who had been caught red-handed. But Isabella wasn't done. Denial is a powerful drug, and she was overdosing on it. She straightened her spine, forcing a mask of arrogance back onto her face. "It doesn't matter," she spat, her eyes wild. "Fine. You own the building. Congratulations. You won the lottery or something. Good for you. But that doesn't change the contract, Margaret. It doesn't change the fact that tonight I am the client. Daniel and I paid for this wedding. We signed the checks. We are the customers. And the customer is always right." She took a step toward Mr. Sterling, her confidence surging back on a wave of delusion. "Mr. Sterling, I don't care if she owns the Taj Mahal. Tonight she is a guest. A guest who was not invited. I paid $50,000 for this event. That gives me the right to control the guest list. That gives me the right to remove anyone I want, including the owner if she is disrupting my private party. So I am going to ask you one last time. Do your job. Remove her, or I will sue this entire company for breach of contract." I looked at her with genuine pity. She really believed it. She really believed that her imaginary money gave her power over me. She had repeated the lie about the $50,000 so many times that she had forgotten it was a fiction. She had forgotten that she hadn't spent a dime. She thought she could buy her way out of this humiliation with a checkbook that was empty. I looked at Mr. Sterling. He looked back at me, his eyebrows raised slightly in a silent question. "Shall I tell her?" he seemed to be asking. "Or would you like the honors?" I smiled. It was a cold, sharp smile. "No, Mr. Sterling," I said quietly. "I think I will handle this." I turned back to my daughter-in-law. "You want to talk about the contract, Isabella. You want to talk about who paid for what. I think that is an excellent idea. Mr. Sterling, do you have the event file with you?" He nodded, tapping the leather folder under his arm. "Right here, Mrs. Vance." "Excellent," I said. I held out my hand. "Give it to me. Let's look at the receipts. Let's see exactly how much of this $50,000 you actually contributed." Mr. Sterling handed me the file. It was a heavy leather-bound portfolio, with the gilded rose crest embossed in gold on the cover. The leather was warm from being held under his arm, and it smelled of expensive polish and old money. I took it, my fingers tracing the edge of the binding, feeling the texture of the grain. The sound of the leather creaking as I opened it was the only noise in the entire ballroom. 300 people were leaning forward, straining to see, straining to hear, holding their breath collectively. It was a theater of humiliation, and I was the director. I pulled out the first document. It was the master invoice, printed on thick cream-colored cardstock. I adjusted my glasses slowly, deliberately, letting the tension ratchet up another notch. Isabella stood 10 feet away, her chest heaving, her eyes darting back and forth between the file and the crowd, like a trapped animal looking for an escape route that didn't exist. She opened her mouth to speak, probably to scream another lie, but I cut her off with a single raised hand. "Let's start with the venue fee," I said, my voice calm and conversational, as if I were reading a grocery list. "You claimed you paid $50,000 for this event, Isabella. Let's see. Item 1. Grand Ballroom Rental, Saturday Evening, Peak Season. The cost is listed here as $18,000. I looked up over the rim of my glasses. Isabella crossed her arms, her chin jutting out defiantly. "Yes, exactly," she snapped. 18,000. We wrote the check last month. I remember signing it. I looked back down at the paper. That is strange, I said. Because right here next to the amount, in the column marked Payment Source, it doesn't say Isabella Vance. It doesn't even say Daniel Vance. It says, E. Vance Holdings LLC. Wire transfer received 6 months ago. I turned the page, the sound of the crisp paper crackling like dry leaves. Let's look at the catering. Item 2. 3-course plated dinner for 300 guests. Filet mignon and lobster tail. Open premium bar. The total cost is $22,500. I paused, looking directly at her. You told me earlier that I was eating the steak you paid for. Do you remember that? Isabella didn't answer. Her face had gone from pale to a splotchy crimson. Her hands were clenched into fists at her sides. I continued reading. Payment status. Paid in full. Payment source. E. Vance Private Trust. I flipped another page. Item 3. Floral arrangements. Imported white hydrangeas and orchids. $8,000. Paid by E. Vance. Item 4. The string quartet that you just screamed at. $2,000. Paid by E. Vance. I closed the file with a soft thud. I looked at the crowd, scanning the faces of the people Isabella had tried to impress. The mayor. Her law partners. The neighbors she had bragged to about her wealth. I want to be very clear, I said, my voice ringing out across the silent room. Isabella and Daniel Vance did not pay $50,000 for this wedding. They did not pay $18,000. They did not pay $5,000. According to this ledger, they have not contributed a single penny to this event. Not for the food. Not for the flowers. Not for the music. And certainly not for the privilege of standing here and insulting the person who actually footed the bill. The reaction was immediate. It started as a low murmur, a rumble of shock and scandal that rippled through the room like a wave. Then came the laughter. It wasn't loud, raucous laughter, but the quiet, cutting snickers of people who have seen a fraud exposed. I saw the mayor lean over to his wife and whisper something, and she covered her mouth to hide a smile. I saw Isabella's boss shaking his head, looking at her with a mixture of pity and professional concern. The facade was gone. The image of the wealthy, powerful power couple had dissolved, leaving behind two grifters who had been living on my charity while spitting in my face. Isabella was shaking now. Her whole body was vibrating with the mixture of rage and shame. She looked at Daniel, but he wouldn't meet her eyes. He was staring at the floor, his shoulders hunched, as if he were trying to make himself disappear. He knew. He had known all along that they couldn't afford this. He had known that I was the safety net, the silent partner, the bank of Mom. But he had let her play the big shot. He had let her take the credit. And now he was letting her take the fall. It's a mistake, Isabella shrieked, her voice shrill and desperate, tearing through the murmurs of the crowd. That file is wrong. You forged it. You and your little manager friend cooked the books to make me look bad. I wrote the checks. I know I did. Daniel, tell them. Tell them we paid. Tell them she is lying. She grabbed Daniel's arm, pulling him violently toward her. Her nails dug into his tuxedo jacket. Say something, you coward. Daniel looked up then. His eyes were red-rimmed and watery. He looked at me standing there with the file in my hand, the owner of the estate, the matriarch he had betrayed. Then he looked at his wife, the woman who was currently digging her nails into his arm and screaming like a banshee. The reality of his life seemed to crash down on him in that moment. The debt. The lies. The constant pressure to keep up appearances. It all broke. No, Isabella, he whispered, his voice hoarse. We didn't pay. We never paid. Mom paid. Mom always pays. Isabella released his arm as if he had burned her. She stumbled back a step, her eyes wide with betrayal. You shut up, she hissed. You shut up right now. But the damage was done. The confession was out. The crowd heard it. The confirmation came from her own husband. She stood alone in the center of the ballroom, isolated in a circle of judgment. She had no money. She had no power. She had no allies. But she still had hate. And like a cornered rat, she decided that if she was going down, she was going to try to take me with her. She straightened her spine, wiping the sweat from her upper lip with the back of her hand. Her eyes narrowed into slits of pure venom. Fine, she spat. Fine. You paid. You own the building. You are the big hero. Are you happy now, Margaret? Do you feel big? Do you feel important? You humiliated us. You ruined your granddaughter's wedding just to prove a point. You are a sad, lonely old witch who has to buy people's love because nobody could ever actually like you. She took a step toward me, ignoring Mr. Sterling, who moved to intercept her. You think owning this place gives you power over me. It gives you nothing. I am still the mother of your grandchildren. I still control who you see and when. And after tonight you will never see Sophie again. I will make sure of it. I will get a restraining order. I will tell the judge you are unstable. I will erase you from this family so completely that even the memory of you will fade. I looked at her. I listened to her threats. I listened to her promise to weaponize my grandchildren against me. And I felt nothing. The fear was gone. The guilt was gone. All that was left was the cold, hard clarity of the final card I had to play. I handed the file back to Mr. Sterling. I took off my glasses and folded them neatly into my purse. You are right about one thing, Isabella, I said softly. I did pay for everything. I paid for the house you live in. I paid for the car you drove here. I paid for the vacation you took last month. But you are wrong about why I did it. I didn't do it to buy your love. I did it because I was trying to protect Sophie. I was trying to keep the family stable. But I see now that stability is a luxury you can no longer afford. Especially not with what I found in the bank records last week. Isabella froze. The color that had returned to her face drained away again, leaving her ghostly pale. Bank records, she whispered. What bank records? I smiled. And this time it wasn't a polite smile. It was the smile of the executioner raising the axe. The records from the Cayman Islands, Isabella. The ones that show where the money from Daniel's business has really been going. You didn't think I would buy a venue this size without doing a full background check on the clients, did you? The Cayman Islands. The words hung in the air, suspended in the silence, like dust motes, caught in a beam of light. I watched the reaction ripple through Isabella's body. It wasn't the explosive rage she had shown earlier, and it wasn't the haughty dismissal of a woman who believes she is untouchable. It was something far more primal. It was the absolute freezing terror of a criminal who realizes the police are at the door. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her hands, which had been clenched into fists, dropped uselessly to her sides. She looked at me, and for the first time in 10 years I saw her truly look at me. She didn't see a mark, or a bank, or a nuisance. She saw the one thing she hadn't accounted for. She saw a businesswoman who knew how to follow a paper trail. I reached into my purse again. This time I didn't pull out a leather folder or a set of keys. I pulled out a simple white business envelope, sealed with red tape. It looked innocuous enough, but in the world of high finance, an envelope like this is heavy enough to crush a life. I tapped it against the palm of my hand, the rhythmic papery sound echoing in the quiet ballroom. You see, Isabella, I said, my voice low and steady. When Daniel came to me 6 months ago, begging for a loan to cover his business payroll, I was suspicious. He is a good architect. His firm brings in $3 million a year. There was no reason for him to be broke. There was no reason for him to be unable to pay his staff. So I didn't just write the check. I did what any responsible investor does. I hired a forensic accountant. Daniel took a step forward. He looked like a man waking up from a long coma, his eyes blinking rapidly, as if trying to clear a fog. A forensic accountant, he repeated, his voice dull and flat. Mom, what are you talking about? My business is fine. We just had some overhead issues, some supply chain delays. That is what Isabella told me. I turned to look at my son. The pain in my chest was sharp, a physical ache for the boy, who had been so thoroughly deceived. No, Daniel. You didn't have supply chain delays. You had a leak to the tune of $15,000 a month for the last 2 years. I opened the envelope and slid out a stack of bank statements, stapled together in neat chronological order. I held them up. The light from the crystal chandelier caught the glossy paper, illuminating the rows of black numbers. I began to read. January 4th. Wire transfer of $4,000 to Apex Consulting Group, based in Grand Cayman. January 18th. Wire transfer of $6,000 to Apex Consulting. February 2nd. Another $4,000. It goes on and on, Daniel. Month after month, week after week. Money siphoned directly from your business operating account into an offshore shell company. Isabella stood frozen, her face a mask of gray ash. She didn't move to stop me. She knew it was too late. The evidence was physical. It was undeniable. Daniel looked at his wife. He looked at the woman he had defended against his own mother for a decade. Isabella, he said, his voice shaking, who is Apex Consulting? We don't use offshore consultants. We are a local firm. Who is that money going to? Isabella tried to speak. She tried to formulate a lie, but her brain seemed to have short-circuited. It is a tax strategy, she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. It is complicated, Daniel. You wouldn't understand. I was trying to save us money on the back end. It is an investment vehicle. I laughed. It was a cold sound devoid of any humor. An investment vehicle, I repeated. That is a creative way to describe it. But my accountant dug a little deeper, Isabella. He didn't just find the shell company. He found the beneficiary. I turned the page, revealing a photograph clipped to the back of the statement. It was a grainy photo taken from a surveillance camera, but the faces were clear enough. It showed a man, a young handsome man with dark hair, and a tan, sitting at a cafe table in Miami. And sitting across from him, holding his hand across the table, was Isabella. The beneficiary of Apex Consulting is a man named Julian Rivera, I said. A personal trainer based in South Beach. A man you have been visiting quite frequently on those girls' trips to Florida you take every 3 months. The crowd gasped. It was a collective intake of breath that sucked the oxygen out of the room. The affair. It was the final nail in the coffin. The embezzlement was bad, but the betrayal was worse. I watched Daniel's face crumble. It didn't happen all at once. It started with his eyes widening in shock, then his jaw went slack, and finally his shoulders collapsed, as if the strings holding him up had been cut. He looked at the photo. He looked at the dates on the bank statements. He looked at his wife. Julian, he whispered. That guy. The tennis instructor. You told me he was gay. You told me he was your friend from college. Isabella closed her eyes, tears finally leaking out from under her lashes. They weren't tears of remorse, I knew. They were tears of self-pity. Tears for the life she had just incinerated. Daniel, please, she sobbed, reaching out a hand toward him. It isn't what it looks like. He was blackmailing me. I had to pay him. It was a mistake. I was trying to protect you. I stepped between them, blocking her hand. Stop it, I said sharply. Stop lying. Just stop. There is no blackmail. There are only text messages, Isabella. Hundreds of them. My investigator found those too. You weren't being blackmailed. You were funding a lifestyle for your boyfriend with your husband's hard-earned money. You were stealing from your daughter's inheritance to buy watches for a man half your age. I turned to the crowd, addressing the room at large, addressing the witnesses to this tragedy. This is why I bought the venue, I said, my voice strong. This is why I controlled the finances. I knew if I gave the money to Daniel, Isabella would just steal it. I knew if I wrote a check for the wedding, it would end up in an account in the Caymans, and Sophie would be getting married in a courthouse. So I paid the vendors directly. I bought the building to ensure that no matter what happened today, my granddaughter would have her dream wedding. Because I knew that once this truth came out, I gestured to the weeping woman and the broken man. There wouldn't be any money left for a party. Daniel turned away from Isabella. He walked over to the nearest chair and sat down, putting his head in his hands. He didn't scream, he didn't yell. He just wept. Quiet, racking sobs that shook his entire body. Sophie, the bride, the girl whose day this was supposed to be, walked over to her father. She didn't look at her mother. She didn't look at me. She just put her arm around her father's shoulders and held him. The sight broke my heart, but it also steeled my resolve. I had to finish this. I had to cut the rot out completely. I turned back to Isabella, who was now standing alone in the center of the ballroom, a pariah in a silver dress. You said you would get a restraining order, I said softly, moving closer to her, until I was the only thing she could see. You said you would erase me from this family. But you forgot one thing, Isabella. You don't live in that house on the hill. You occupy it. The deed to that house is in Daniel's name, but the mortgage is held by a private lender. Do you know who that lender is? Isabella looked up, her eyes wide with a new fresh horror. No, she whispered. No, you didn't. I nodded. I did. I bought the note from the bank 3 years ago, when you missed 4 payments in a row. I own your house, Isabella. I own your car. I own the venue we are standing in. And as of this moment, I am calling in the debt. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating, like the humidity before a thunderstorm. I own your house. I watched the realization sink into Isabella's consciousness, not as a sudden shock, but as a slow creeping paralysis that started in her eyes and worked its way down to her trembling hands. She looked around the room frantically, searching for an exit, searching for a lawyer, searching for anyone who would tell her that this was just a nightmare she could wake up from. But there were no exits. There were only 300 witnesses who had just learned that the queen of the ball was nothing more than a squatter, living on her mother-in-law's charity. She tried to speak, but her voice was gone, replaced by a dry rasping sound. You can't, she whispered. You can't just kick us out. We have rights. We have a lease. We are family. I took a step closer, crossing the final distance between us, until I was standing right in her personal space, the space she had invaded so aggressively only an hour ago. You have nothing, Isabella, I said, my voice low and hard like granite. You don't have a lease. You have a mortgage that hasn't been paid by you in 4 years. You don't have rights because you violated every clause of the good faith agreement when you stole from my son's company. And as for family, I looked at the grainy photo of her holding hands with her lover in Miami, the photo that was still lying on the table like an accusation. Family doesn't steal the college fund to pay for a boyfriend. Family doesn't try to have the grandmother arrested at a wedding. You broke the covenant, Isabella, and now you are going to face the eviction. I turned to Mr. Sterling, who was watching the scene with the grim satisfaction of a man who hates bullies. Mr. Sterling, I said, my voice projecting clearly to the back of the room, I believe we have a trespasser on the premises. An individual who has no legal right to be here, who has disrupted the peace, and who has harassed the ownership. Please have security remove her immediately. And Mr. Sterling, I want a formal ban issued. If she steps foot on the Gilded Rose property again, I want her arrested for criminal trespassing. Isabella let out a scream that wasn't human. It was the sound of a wounded animal, cornered and vicious. No, she shrieked, lunging toward me, her fingers curled into claws. You can't do this to me. I am the mother of the bride. This is my party. You old witch, I will kill you. But she never reached me. Marcus, the security guard, moved with a speed that belied his size. He stepped between us, catching her wrists in one large hand, not hurting her, but holding her with the immovable force of a stone wall. That is enough, Mrs. Vance, he said, his voice deep and final. You are leaving now. She fought him. It was a pathetic, undignified struggle. She kicked at his shins, her silver heels scraping uselessly against his uniform trousers. She thrashed and screamed, cursing me, cursing Daniel, cursing the world that had finally stopped believing her lies. Daniel, I shouted at my son, who was still sitting with his head in his hands. Daniel, do something. Tell them to stop. Tell them who I am. Daniel stood up slowly. He looked older than his 36 years, his face lined with the sudden exhaustion of a man who has lost everything. He looked at his wife, thrashing in the grip of the security guard. He looked at the mascara running down her face. He looked at the woman who had spent 10 years isolating him from his mother. I am telling them who you are, Isabella, Daniel said, his voice quiet but carrying in the silence. You are a liar, you are a thief, and you are a stranger to me. I am done. Take her out, Marcus. Please just get her out of here. Isabella stopped fighting. She went limp in Marcus's grip, staring at her husband with wide disbelief. Daniel, she whispered, baby, please. But Daniel had already turned his back. He walked over to me, and for the first time in a decade, he didn't look past me. He looked at me. He took my hand, the same hand that had signed the checks, and held the secrets and squeezed it. I am sorry, Mom, he whispered, tears leaking from his eyes. I am so sorry, I didn't know, I should have known. Marcus began to drag Isabella toward the exit. She didn't go quietly. She screamed all the way to the door, hurling insults that echoed off the vaulted ceilings, until the heavy oak doors finally slammed shut, cutting off her voice like a switch had been flipped. The silence that rushed back into the room was profound. It was the silence of a fever breaking. The air felt cleaner, lighter. I looked around the ballroom. The guests were still staring, but the expressions had changed. There was no more judgment. There was no more mockery. There was only respect, and perhaps a little fear. They looked at the woman in the navy polyester dress, and they didn't see a poor relation anymore. They saw the matriarch. They saw the power. Sophie walked over to me, her white dress rustling softly against the marble floor. She looked at the door, where her mother had just been ejected, and then she looked at me. Her eyes were sad, but they were clear. Grandma, she said softly, taking my other hand. Thank you. I know that was hard. I know you didn't want to do that. But thank you for saving us. Thank you for saving my dad. I pulled her into a hug, burying my face in the silk and lace that I had paid for. I didn't do it to be a hero, Sophie. I whispered into her hair. I did it because I love you, and because no one gets to treat my family like that, not even your mother. The rest of the night was a blur of bittersweet celebration. The string quartet started playing again, a tentative waltz that slowly grew in confidence. The waiters brought out the food, the filet mignon and lobster, that Isabella had bragged about but never paid for. Mr. Sterling personally escorted me from table 19. He didn't ask. He just picked up my purse and my glass of water and led me across the room. He walked me past the staring guests, past the centerpieces, past the whispers. He pulled out the chair at the head of table 1, the seat of honor, the seat that had been reserved for the host. Please, Mrs. Vance, he said, bowing slightly, your dinner is served. I sat down. I looked at the crystal glass in front of me, filled with the vintage champagne I had selected months ago. I looked at Daniel sitting to my right, talking quietly with his daughter, beginning the long, slow process of healing. I looked at the empty chair, where Isabella should have been, and felt a strange sense of peace. I wasn't happy that it had ended this way. No mother wants to destroy her son's marriage. No grandmother wants to throw the mother of the bride out of the wedding. But as I took a sip of the cold, crisp wine, I knew I had done the right thing. I had cut out the cancer. I had balanced the ledger. I drove home that night in my 10-year-old Buick, the gravel crunching under the tires as I left the estate. The gates closed behind me, locking away the drama and the noise. I pulled into the driveway of my small house on Maple Street, the one Isabella had mocked, the one that was paid for and quiet and mine. I walked into my kitchen and turned on the kettle. I sat at my small formica table and listened to the silence. It wasn't the silence of loneliness. It was the silence of victory. I thought about the deed in my safe. I thought about the eviction notice I would file on Monday morning. I thought about the look on Isabella's face when she realized that the checkbook she had worshipped was closed forever. I smiled. It was a small, tired smile. They say money can't buy happiness, and maybe that is true. But as I sat there sipping my tea, I realized that money can buy something else. It can buy justice. And on a cold Saturday in October, that was more than enough for me.